The AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. Centrist leader Jim Kessler says the rank and file have disappeared in both political parties. Philanthropy expert David Callahan explains who the new philanthropists are and why they give money. And Bill Press talks with Oregon Congressman Earl Blumenauer on anti-Trump actions. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Jim Kessler is Vice President for Policy of the Third Way, a centrist think tank, and he notes that Democrats have lost power because their base lives in very few enclaves and rarely in rural areas. And we say hello to Jim Kessler, Senior Vice President for Policy at Third Way, a centrist think tank in Washington. Jim Kessler, thanks very much for joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org.
Thank you.
Well, it's nice to have you with us. How much of the Clinton loss was just a matter of poor campaign tactics in the Rust Belt? I mean, she did win a majority and did it the way Karl Rove did by assembling a base of components that can win 51%.
So look, I think part of it for Hillary Clinton is they did make some mistakes. I mean, they probably thought Michigan and Wisconsin were in the bag, judging by how few times they actually visited there. And they did, they were competing pretty hard in Pennsylvania, which they lost. But so there's definitely mistakes there. I think it would be a real mistake to attribute it to just some campaign mistakes. So first of all, since 2009, Democrats have lost 1/5 of the Senate seats that it once held, 1/4 of the House seats, nearly half of the governor's offices it held, and more than half of the state legislatures that it controlled at the time. So Hillary's loss is really the final indignity of 8 years of Democratic losses that has put the Democratic Party in the worst shape that it's been in, since Reconstruction in the 1870s. So she did win the popular vote. Congratulations. But, you need to win the Electoral College, and the Democrats' problems, I think, go deeper than that.
So are you saying that even if a Democrat can win the popular or even Electoral College vote, the demographics are such that they'll keep losing down-ballot races?
So demography, Democrats had this theory really starting about 15 years ago that demography was going to equal destiny, that the rising number of non-white and millennial voters across the nation would, kind of seal Democratic victories in lots and lots of places because these non-white voters vote overwhelmingly Democratic. And it was a nice theory on paper. It didn't work out in practice for a couple of reasons. One is demography is not equally distributed in this country. So, if there's a big surge in the Latino or the African-American population and it's a bigger win in California, it doesn't really help us anywhere. Our Constitution, for better or for worse, gives sparse places in this country a lot of power. And these sparse places, these flyover states, they're overwhelmingly white. And, Wyoming gets 2 Senate seats. California gets 2 Senate seats. Montana gets 1 governor. New York gets 1 governor. These large, empty states have a lot of power.
So progressives have to move to rural or red states?
Well, that's one option. We can it's time to move. Let's pack our bags. Let's get in the VW bus and move out there. And actually, the truth is there's actually millennials are moving to some of these states and some of these smaller cities, Nashville, Pittsburgh, some of these other medium-sized cities are home to a lot of new millennials that are looking for inexpensive housing costs and a place to start businesses. So maybe some of that is happening. But, maybe a better idea than forced migration is to have an agenda that appeals to some of these rural and small town areas, some exurban areas in the country, while also appealing to, Democrats' base constituencies and the urban cores, and also the suburban constituencies where we're starting to do better.
And we're speaking with Jim Kessler, Senior Vice President for Policy at Third Way, a centrist think tank in Washington. Jim, how do Democrats even hope to compete in the gerrymandered House where the only competitive districts are demographically closer to Republicans, that is, white?
Right. So there are 435 congressional districts. There is a group called the Cook Report that does nonpartisan ratings of districts about whether they're safe blue, safe red, or up for grabs purple. 159 districts are considered safe blue, and sure enough, Democrats have 158 seats in those 159 districts. Demographically, those districts are 55% non-white and 45% white. The red districts, there's 186 of them. They're 75% white and 25% non-white. The up for grabs purple districts, there's 90 of them. They're 70% white and 30% non-white. So, the demography, part of it is gerrymandering, that's for sure. Part of it is, in these urban cores, there just is a concentration of minority voters there. So even without gerrymandering, you're going to have districts that look this way. So we're going to have to appeal to these minority voters that have been our base and have been so good to Democrats, have an agenda that appeals to them, but then also be able to appeal to some other voters. And then, just remember, it's not just the House, like the Senate, there's a lot of states that just by their demography, if you just looked at their demography, about half of these states are so white that you would, if we're waiting for demography's destiny, half of those states are just going to be in Republican hands. So we need to do something. We need to do a little better with some of these white voters.
Does the decimation of the Democratic Party since 2009 signal the end of the party itself as a force in American politics?
I don't think so, and I certainly hope not. If you look at where progress has been made in this country, they're generally made under Democratic administrations and Democratic Congresses. That's where progress happens. And so, having a strong and vibrant Democratic Party is important. That's where we made a lot of gains with in civil rights for African Americans and Latinos, for gay and lesbian people, and it's where we made a lot of gains in the economy as well. So, the Democratic Party has to be vibrant. There's a pendulum to things, and I think right now Democrats are at the full, end of a negative pendulum. But I also feel that Democrats they know how to talk to people in blue areas, and they know how to talk about the American dream in blue areas, because the blue areas of the country are places where technology and globalization are a benefit, not a hindrance. We need to have a greater understanding of the American dream now in red areas and in purple areas, where the forces of globalization and technology is wind in the face, not, wind from behind. And that's what Democrats need to do to get back. I mean, the other option is just hope Donald Trump does such a horrible job that people will say, like, okay, we tried that, we're going to vote Democratic. That certainly could happen. That's not a long-term strategy for Democratic success.
Now, obviously, your organization believes there is a third way. Does that mean centrists might start running candidates for office as a third party?
That's an interesting question. And so, Third Way, we're a nonpartisan organization, but we work almost solely with Democrats, and see that, the roots of the Third Way, in the 90s it was Bill Clinton, and in Britain it was Tony Blair. I think two things. First of all, the challenge for centrism is for it to be as bold and dynamic as anything on either wings of the party. It needs to capture the imagination, and I think when centrism is not doing well. It seems like it's splitting the difference between two sides. So centrism needs to be bold, dynamic, aggressive, forward-looking. What we saw in the last presidential election essentially was an independent candidate, Donald Trump, do a hostile takeover of the Republican Party, and an independent candidate, Bernie Sanders, attempt to do a hostile takeover of the Democratic Party. So he wasn't able to succeed, but he did very well. And I think you're seeing among rank-and-file voters a disappointment with both parties. My hope is that the Democratic Party becomes more competitive, becomes a party of ideas, that those ideas are a mix of progressive and centrist ideas that, help the new economy work for more people, for people in all parts of the country. If you look at the millennial generation of voters, in their consumer choices, they're not necessarily binary choice voters. They could be open to a third party, and I think that would be worrying if you're a Democrat. You need to appeal to them because it's very possible they could split off in the future. But my hope is that the third way resides within the Democratic Party.
All right, Jim Kessler, Senior Vice President for Policy at Third Way, centrist think tank in Washington, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Jim, thank you so much for your time. We do look forward to having you back again soon.
Thank you.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. David Callahan studies philanthropy, who the rich people are, who they're giving their money to, and what it means for public policy. And we'll talk to him about all of that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
In addition to news, which involves reporting on real stuff, there's now fake news, stuff that's completely made up. But wait, the barons of corporate news are also adding to today's tumultuous state of journalism by putting out BS news. Stuff they know is untrue, but is reported because it advances their owner's political agenda. For example, the Washington Post, owned by Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos, who's a laissez-faire promoter of privatizing government functions, keeps publishing a load of BS to denigrate our post offices. In an alarmist editorial, the paper declared the U.S. Postal Service continues to hemorrhage red ink. Embracing Bezos' privatization ideology, the editors grumped that postal unions have made our mail service outmoded and insolvent, running up, quote, a net loss of $5.6 billion last year. That is pure bovine excrement, and the editors know it. In fact, thanks to innovative and efficient postal workers, the mail agency racked up a $610 million operating profit last year and a $1.2 billion profit the year before. The $5 billion in red ink that the paper's propagandists pointed to, is nothing but a bookkeeping hoax created by Congress to make people believe our post office is a hopeless money loser that must be privatized. In 2006, Congress manufactured an artificial loss for the Postal Service by decreeing that it pre-fund the health care costs of future retirees 75 years in advance. That includes retirees who are not even born yet. No other agency and no corporation, including Amazon, could survive if Congress added a $5 billion a year fictitious loss to their books. This is Jim Hightower saying, yet, in a shameful piece of BS journalism, the Washington Post intentionally ignored the true story.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Author David Callahan says progressive groups are leading the fight against money in politics, but are ignoring the role of money in philanthropy, partly because they're on the dole themselves. And we say hello to David Callahan, founder and editor of Inside Philanthropy, a digital media site that covers the world of giving by wealthy donors and foundations. He's also an author in his latest book, The Givers, Money, Power, and Philanthropy in a New Gilded Age. David Callahan, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
It's great to be here.
And nice to have you with us. So there are more than 500 billionaires on the Forbes 400 list. Where did they all come from, and what are they doing with their money?
Well, over the past couple decades, we've seen a massive run-up in wealth in the hands of the people at the very top of the income ladder. Some of the great fortunes we're really familiar with, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, the Koch brothers. But below those people, those mega rich, there's just a tremendous number of other wealthy people. And more of them are now turning to philanthropy. They have a lot of different goals, things that they want to do with their giving. It ranges from medical research to combating climate change to overhauling our public school system. Everywhere you look, it seems these days, you'll find some billionaire pushing some big idea with outsized charitable gifts. And it's been a real new thing that has gained a lot of steam just recently.
Well, and while these rich folks are giving away tons of money for the good causes, a couple of that you mentioned there, I mean, you would consider that a good thing, but you find a problem. What is the problem with it?
Well, when you think of philanthropy, many people, what comes to mind is giving for museums or hospitals or social service agencies. What most people don't think of is the way that philanthropy can play a big role in shaping public policy, the way that money can be used to, push a particular agenda, whether it's on taxes or economic policy or criminal justice policy or environmental policy. Both the left and the right do it, and we're seeing more of that kind of activist giving. And I think that does raise concerns. I think we're all familiar with what's wrong with money in politics. When billionaires give campaign gifts or fund super PACs, most of us have thought much less about the way that philanthropic dollars can also buy influence. And to me, that's just another form of money in politics, and we need to take a closer look at it.
We're speaking with David Callahan, founder and editor of Inside Philanthropy, and his latest book is The Givers, Money, Power, and Philanthropy in a New Gilded Age. So, and you call the big givers a new power elite. So are they using the power of their money for nefarious purposes?
Well, they're using it for everything. As I said, you can find these big givers on both the left and the right. If you're on the left, maybe you're worried about the Koch brothers or Robert Mercer, who's recently emerged as a major figure in conservative philanthropy. If you're on the right, maybe you worry about George Soros. And my point is that all of this stuff is troubling because this philanthropic money is coming into more areas. Just name any public policy area, and you can find billionaires and other wealthy donors who are pushing an agenda. We've certainly all heard a lot about the charter school giving by the Walton family or Eli Broad or other billionaires pushing for charter schools. Many of them are to the right donors on the conservative spectrum. On the left, we've seen a lot of giving lately to combat climate change. Michael Bloomberg being one of the big donors in that space, giving tons of money to the Sierra Club to try to shut down coal-fired power plants. And it's just, I see it as sort of this rising tide of ideological giving to shape public policy at a time when many Americans kind of feel that their voice doesn't count, and they're on the sidelines, and they're looking at these battles that, over policy that increasingly look like, these Greek gods throwing lightning bolts at each other.
Well, obviously, you suggest a lot of the new money, especially the Koch brothers and Walton, as you mentioned, going into politics. But really, what is wrong with it, since on the other side, the liberals do, of course, have, as you mentioned, George Soros, Pritzker family, and others. Is that such a bad thing? I mean, perhaps if I support, I don't have a lot of money, but I support the things that perhaps a George Soros is doing, what's wrong with that?
Well, what's wrong with it is that most ordinary citizens don't have that kind of big money. And so it's about who gets to speak in the public square. Even if you agree with George Soros or maybe you agree with the Koch brothers, to me, it's not about the substance of the policy views. It's about the fact that most people, have limited means to affect public policy. They can sign a petition, they can go to a protest march, they can call their representative. They cannot write $10 million checks to public policy groups to go out and, try to sway public policy. And to me, that's the problem here is civic inequality. It is, the fact that a small slice of people at the very top of the income ladder have a greater and greater say over how our public policy debates go. And I see, this as an analog to what's happened in our political process, which is that ordinary voters are being pushed aside by super PAC donors and other deep-pocketed givers who've come to really dominate our electoral politics. Well, the same thing is happening in civil society, and I do think it's a problem.
Is this almost a smokescreen for the income inequality that is widening? In other words, they're putting all this money, and it seems like it's good things, and perhaps I support one or the other, so I'll just feel good about that, but I'm not really being represented?
Yes. I mean, if you think about inequality, there's been a lot of talk about inequality. Most people focus on economic inequality, how much money the wealthy have compared to everybody else. But the other side of inequality, of course, is political inequality, how much voice and how much power the wealthy have compared to everybody else. And, what we've seen again and again through history and what we're seeing now is that economic inequality tends to translate directly into political or civic inequality. That, it's just that when people have lots and lots of money, they have more ways to be heard in public debates. And again, we're all familiar with how that plays out when it comes to electoral politics with billionaires who have a huge say in primary battles and in electing, members of Congress and electing presidents. My point is we're now seeing that inequality effect, that civic inequality effect, starting to flow into civil society and our nonprofit sector in ways that many people haven't maybe been paying so much attention to because, as you say, we may like what this person is doing or what that person is doing.
Now, obviously, this won't happen, but what if charitable giving lost its tax deductibility, or even the amount was limited? Is that something that you would see as a favorable thing to do?
Well, to me, the ideal situation would be that when it comes to these public policy battles and who's speaking out on different issues, that the groups that are speaking out are groups that really represent lots of Americans, which is the way it used to be more. Like labor unions were a powerful force in public policy and politics 50 years ago. They had a lot of members, right? And or the AARP, when it speaks, they're speaking for a lot of members. They have millions of members. The NRA has millions of members. Like, these are real groups with real constituencies. And, I think that maybe limiting tax breaks that you can get by giving to sort of faux groups. I mean, there's a lot of kind of grass tops, faux, groups that don't really speak for anybody, but are propped up by billionaires giving tax-deductible gifts, and those groups often have a lot of sway in public policy. I do think we need to look at whether we want to end the tax deductions for gifts to those kinds of organizations.
It would be interesting to see if somebody actually put that forward, because I just don't see that happening. I don't see that passing muster by most folks, because I think a lot of them like that money and where it's going.
Right. Well, I do think that there's not a lot of support for this idea on either the left and the right.
Right.
I find it interesting that the left has been really led the fight against money in politics, and the campaign finance groups in Washington tend to be progressive organizations. But these same reformers have given very little attention to the philanthropic money coming into politics, in part because they're on the dole, right? That's how their organizations are supported, and that's where their paychecks come from. So I do think that there's some contradictions there within the progressive reform community.
Well, they did try and strike it out of politics, but that just didn't work out so well.
Well, yeah, I mean, for sure, there have been efforts, and there are continuing efforts to reform campaign donations, and a big focus has been trying to get the big donors out and have small donors be the people who are driving the show. And I think that's what you want ideally, is if there is money in politics, and there's always going to be money in politics, you want it to be lots of small gifts coming from ordinary citizens who are giving small amounts, like we saw in the Bernie Sanders campaign. What you don't want it to be is a few billionaire donors who are writing really big checks and having outsized influence. And that's what we see too often in politics. And now we're seeing also in our nonprofit world and civil society sector as well.
Yeah, okay. David Callahan, founder and editor of Inside Philanthropy. His latest book, The Giver's Money, Power, and Philanthropy in a New Gilded Age. David, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
Great to be here. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Congressman Earl Blumenauer on a 25th Amendment solution to Donald Trump.
Hey, Congressman, how are you?
I'm terrific.
All right. Nice to see you.
Good to see you, sir.
You've got your bicycle. You've come in to see us before, actually, in your bicycle clothes, right?
Well, that's true. But since you've gone to this format with a camera, I figured I'd couth up, put a bow tie on, leave my bike helmet in the hallway there.
All right. Well, dressed in sports clothes or your great suit with your bow tie, it's good to see you. And you've been stirring things up. You and Maxine Waters stirring things up with the subject of the big I word, impeachment for Donald Trump. Isn't it a little too early to talk about that?
Well, of course, I'm actually focusing on something else, Bill, because I am focusing on the 25th Amendment, which speaks to presidential disability.
Right.
We just celebrated the 50th anniversary of that amendment just a few weeks ago.
Which is the alternative to impeachment, isn't it?
Well, what it speaks to is when a president is incapacitated. And we've had, as you well know, periods in our history before, most famously Woodrow Wilson, when his wife Edith ran the country after his stroke. And that was created to have a process whereby if the president was incapacitated, he could temporarily or permanently be relieved of his duties and it transferred to the vice president. As I was examining this the involuntary nature of it, it occurred to me that if it was going to be used in the case of a president who was just mentally unstable, who was delusional, that actually the 25th Amendment as written would not operate because it requires that the vice president and the president's cabinet, his executive officers, make this decision. Well, a delusional, paranoid, mentally unstable president could just fire the cabinet, and then the 25th Amendment couldn't work. So I've proposed legislation.
And they have to, as I understand it, right, that they have to then, the vice president and the cabinet would have to request Congress to remove the president.
They would trigger it.
Right.
And then it goes on to Congress.
Yeah.
So I've proposed an alternative to the president's cabinet because the language says, or such body as the Congress may designate. And so I'm proposing that alternative body be all former presidents and vice presidents. It's bipartisan. They know the stresses and demands of the job. It would be credible in the eyes of the American public.
Sure.
And a delusional president couldn't fire them.
You'd have Republicans and Democrats, right?
Yep.
It'd be a pretty small body, too. They're never,
right.
At most 5, I think, in our lifetime at one time. Wouldn't it take an act of Congress? No.
Ultimately, the Congress...
You'd have to amend the Constitution?
No. Because in the constitutional amendment, there was a phrase, or such body as Congress would designate. So Congress, by law, can designate an alternative group. And so I'm circulating a piece of legislation that would provide that alternative.
Right. You mentioned Woodrow Wilson, but the 25th Amendment came after Wilson's day, right?
Absolutely.
Has it ever been implemented, ever been used?
It has been. We've had situations when for example, most recently when President Bush was undergoing an operation that he would have been under anesthetic. It was invoked so that it was clear that all the powers were transferred to the vice president at that time. There were times, actually, in the Reagan administration where some of his staff speculated about whether or not this early onset Alzheimer's had meant that he wasn't up to it, and they considered invoking it in the 80s.
That's where it comes from, doesn't it? I mean, at that period?
No, it was put in effect immediately after the assassination of President Kennedy. To be able to have an orderly transition, it was extensive work by the Senate Judiciary Committee that ultimately, 50 years ago, resulted in the adoption of this amendment.
Right.
We had a Democratic member of Congress in here a couple weeks ago who said that there is sort of an unspoken thing going on among Republicans, Democrats in Congress. Everybody understands that there is something very wrong with Donald Trump. What do you think that is? What do you think is wrong with Donald Trump?
I don't know. I mean, this every day is a new facet of a troubled administration, and one doesn't know if it's an act or he is just incompetent or, tweeting in the middle of the night. It's beyond my can in terms of watching these radical changes. He's now this week backed off of all his earlier demands, and it looks like we may keep the government open, although they're working hard to make the Affordable Care Act proposal that the Republicans had worse in order to get more votes. I don't know. But I do know that we're working hard to be able to make sure that we're resisting some of the more outrageous things that he does, to be able to focus this energy in our community and elsewhere, to be able to make a difference politically and being able to help vulnerable people. And then I've had some legislation, for example, the No Trump Act, that I'm circulating to make it harder to for a president who is engaged in ongoing businesses with himself and his family to profit by it. It wasn't interesting, the State Department website advertising his properties this last week? You can't make this up, can you?
No. And the fact that he spent every other weekend at his property in Florida, Mar-a-Lago, that when he's in Washington, the only place he goes out to dinner is his hotel, right? And Ivanka Trump, getting the new permits to do business in China the same day she happens to be having dinner with the president of China and her daddy. No, I mean, on and on and on.
All coincidence, Bill. All
coincidence. Nobody else could get away with these kinds of conflicts, but nobody seems to be stepping up to do anything. There are a couple of lawsuits pending, but...
Well, I think increasingly, part of it is people have been in shock by all the stuff that's going on and trying to react to really destructive things. I think it wears thin with the American public. It's one of the reasons why he has the worst approval rating of any president in our history at this point in his term of office. And when something else blows up, when the Russian investigation or some grotesque conflict of interest is something that people can't ignore, I think some of these dominoes will fall.
You mentioned health care. Help us out. What's going on with health care? So, the first attempt bombs, and then the president looked like at one time wanted to walk away from it, and then the White House says, no, we really want to get something passed before the 100 days so we can say we've repealed Obamacare. And yesterday, the Tea Party, otherwise known as the Freedom Caucus, they come out and say, okay, we finally got a bill that we'll support, and we give it our full support. What does it do, and what are the chances that they're actually going to get this done? They're going to vote on it tomorrow?
Well, that's not clear. But you're right. The Freedom Caucus worked actively to take a bill that they didn't have enough votes to bring to the floor a couple weeks ago, and they've actively made it worse. They have taken provisions that that protect pre-existing conditions, that are there to make sure that the insurance people get is actually insurance. So
all the good parts of Obamacare.
The things that actually make it so worthwhile, and they're undercutting it. And, of course, they include in this the provision to unwind Medicaid, which is the largest health care program in the country, which they would destabilize, that they would make a one-way trip to restrict coverage in the future. I think it's a stretch. I had conversations this morning with a couple of people we call in the governing wing of the Republican Party.
Tuesday group, so-called.
There are people there who are grown-ups who are deeply concerned about the implications. And not all the Freedom Caucus has signed on. Maybe it's not bad enough for them. And the fact is that all the preliminary indications are, as the facts come out about what they're talking about, the public is less enthusiastic about it than they were before. So I think it's doubtful that it'll be voted on Friday. Not impossible, but having made a bad bill worse, I don't know is the formula for success.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Jim Kessler, David Callahan, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.